stranded on a desert island. No hope, no help. What would you do? Welcome back to Bookshelf, where timeless adventures come alive. In this chapter of Robinson Crusoe, we dive into the thrilling tale of survival, resilience, and the ultimate test of human spirit. You won't want to miss how Crusoe starts his incredible journey towards self-reliance and discovery. If you're enjoying this epic story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Bookshelf for more captivating audiobooks. Your support helps us bring these classics to life, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Now, let's jump right into the adventure. Chapter 2: Slavery and Escape. That evil influence which carried me first away from my father's house, which hurried me into the wild and indigested notion of raising my fortune, and that impressed those conceits so forcibly upon me as to make me deaf to all good advice, and to the entreaties and even the commands of my father. I say the same influence, whatever it was, presented the most unfortunate of all enterprises to my view, and I went on board a vessel bound to the coast of Africa, or, as our sailors vulgarly call it, a voyage to Guinea. It was my great misfortune that in all these adventures I did not ship myself as a sailor, where, it is most probable, I might have worked out of the state of life into which I had cast myself, and might, in time, have raised myself to a good degree of proficiency and knowledge in the navigation and become fit for a mate or lieutenant, if not for a master. But, as it was always my fate to choose for the worse, so I did here. For having money in my pocket and good clothes upon my back, I would always go on board in the habit of a gentleman, and so I neither had any business in the ship, nor learned to do any. It was my lot, first of all, to fall into pretty good company in London, which does not always happen to such loose and unguided young fellows as I then was, the devil generally not omitting to lay some snare for them very early. But it was not so with me. I first fell acquainted with the master of a ship who had been on the coast of Guinea, and who, having had very good success there, was resolved to go again. This captain, taking a fancy to my conversation, which was not at all disagreeable at that time, hearing me say I had a mind to see the world, told me if I would go the voyage with him, I should be at no expense. I should be his messmate and his companion. And if I could carry anything with me, I should have all the advantage of it that the trade would admit, and perhaps I might meet with some encouragement. I embraced the offer, and entering into a strict friendship with this captain, who was an honest, plain-dealing man, I went the voyage with him. This was the first voyage I made, and I shall be the more particular in it because it was my first enterprise, and for a while I thought it my only voyage, that if I returned to England, I should never go to sea more. But I shall come to that in its order. Things going on thus smoothly, my mind was for a while entirely composed by the prospect of what was before me and the agreeable conversation of my new friend. The captain, who was always very obliging and agreeable, let me into the whole history of the trading to the coast of Guinea, told me how the trade of Europeans was managed there, and what was chiefly to be got, how they purchased upon the coast, what returns were made, and how easily the Negroes might be bought on the coast, as it was called, for trifles, such as beads, toys, knives, scissors, hatchets, bits of glass, and the like, by which, in return, they had gold dust, elephants' teeth, and other things of value. All these things he made me fully understand, and I was very well pleased with my voyage in the beginning of it. While we were upon the coast of Guinea, it happened that several of our men fell sick and died, and among the rest my friend the captain. This was a great loss to me, as indeed it was to the whole voyage. The ship was in a confused condition, and the voyage was at a standstill. I went on shore as often as I could to divert myself, but nothing offered to my advantage. We had some English factors on shore, who had brought us what goods they had, which we bought upon good terms. They were not great traders, but being in the neighborhood of the Portuguese settlement, they had access to their market. In this situation, the ship lay for some time under the care of the mate, who went on trading with the natives. But when they had no goods left to dispose of, the mate proposed that I should go on shore with him in the longboat to see what could be done. When I was on shore, I was charmed with the prospects of the country and the manner of the natives, who were simple and innocent, full of good humor, and extremely courteous and kind. They traded with us for trifles, as my friend the captain had told me. such as beads, glass, and other baubles, which they valued highly. But their chief trade was in gold dust and slaves, which, however, I had no idea of carrying on. One morning early, as we lay on the coast, a great storm blew, and the ship had much ado to ride at anchor. The storm increasing, the mate advised me to stay on shore, to which I agreed, and spent the night in a small tent we had set up for that purpose. However, the storm abated the next day, and the ship escaped with little damage, though she had shipped some water. In this manner, we continued trading upon the coast for several weeks, making short voyages between the ship and the shore in the longboat for the purpose of barter. But to cut short this part of my story, we set sail for England, having made a tolerable voyage, and brought home a considerable quantity of gold dust and other things of value. I was, in short, made very much for the voyage, about 300 pounds sterling in gold dust and other goods, and resolved to go on the same voyage again, under the command of the mate, who now took charge of the ship. Having resolved to go on the same voyage again, I stayed in London about 4 months, during which time I gave myself up to seeing the town and spending my money as foolishly as it was possible for a young man to do. However, at last, I met the same mate again, and promised to go the voyage with him. But as I had now made a little adventure of my own, I resolved to trade upon my own account. I bought myself a share in the ship, which was a good ship, and capable of making a very good voyage. I resolved also to take a servant with me, who should manage my business and receive my instructions on shore, for I knew very well that the trade at the coast of Guinea consisted chiefly of trifles, and that to manage the trade I should always be obliged to be on board the ship to see to the business myself. In this second voyage, I acquired great knowledge of the navigation and management of the ship, and also of the nature of the trade upon the coast. But I was surprised to find the captains generally in league with one another to cheat the owners. When we came to Guinea, I discovered some fraudulent practices, which I exposed to the owners upon our return, and they were highly pleased with my conduct. During this voyage, I dealt for myself as well as for the ship, and carried out about 100 pounds in such toys and trifles as the captain had recommended to me. These I sold for 600% profit, and brought home about 500 pounds in gold dust. Thus encouraged, I resolved to venture once more on the same voyage, and, in partnership with the mate who had become master of the ship, we put together about 2,000 pounds worth of goods to trade on our own account. But before I proceed, I must relate a terrible disaster that befell me in my next venture. Certainly. Here's the continuation of Chapter 2 from Robinson Crusoe. This was my third voyage, and I resolved, if possible, to prepare myself for a settled life afterward. Having sold my adventure successfully, and resolved to go on board a third time, I became acquainted with several merchants in London, with whom I dealt, and by whom I was advised to embark again for Guinea. This time, I joined a ship bound for the Canary Islands, intending to proceed from thence to the coast of Africa. Unfortunately, this voyage proved disastrous, as the ship was taken by a Turkish rover of Salih, a notorious pirate. We were captured, and the crew and I were made slaves. I was particularly reserved for the captain's use, who took me to his house. There I was treated with some distinction, as I showed signs of willingness to adapt to my captivity. Yet, my spirit yearned for freedom, and I began to plan my escape. After 2 years in captivity, I had a stroke of luck. The captain had taken a liking to me and trusted me more than the other slaves. He often allowed me to go fishing in a small boat with a young Moor as my companion. On one such trip, I managed to gather provisions secretly, including bread, water, and some weapons. I persuaded the Moor to accompany me on a fishing trip farther out to sea. When we were out of sight of the coast, I overpowered the Moor, threatening him with death if he did not comply. Terrified, he agreed to help me. Together, we navigated the small boat away from the coast, heading for open water and the hope of escape. After several days at sea, enduring great hardship, I was rescued by a Portuguese ship bound for Brazil. The captain of the ship treated me kindly, and I began to tell him my story. He sympathized with my plight, and seeing my destitution, offered to take me to Brazil and help me establish myself there. In Brazil, I began a new life, working on a plantation and cultivating sugar. I became moderately prosperous and, for a time, considered myself settled. However, the longing for adventure soon stirred within me once again. I had resolved to stay in Brazil and settled as a planter. In this situation, I lived some time and became acquainted with many people, some of whom treated me with great civility and friendship. My stock increased and my plantation prospered. However, as time went on, I began to grow restless once more. The Portuguese captain who had saved me initially had a close relationship with me and often conversed about the opportunities of trading. He spoke about the possibility of buying slaves from the coast of Africa to increase the labor force in the plantations. One day, while conversing with him and other planters, the idea struck me as feasible. They convinced me to embark on another voyage to the coast of Africa to bring back slaves for my plantation. This dangerous venture required significant investment, but I had confidence in my trading skills and experience. I prepared for the voyage, gathering provisions and equipping the ship. We set sail with high hopes, bound once again for Africa. However, fate intervened tragically. We had barely begun our voyage when a violent storm struck our ship. The storm was unlike any I had encountered before. It raged for days, battering our vessel mercilessly. Our ship was driven off course and eventually struck upon a sandbank. The impact was catastrophic. The ship began to break apart. In the ensuing chaos, the crew scrambled for safety, but most were lost to the merciless sea. I managed to grab onto a piece of the wreckage and was carried ashore by the waves. Exhausted and terrified, I found myself alone on an uninhabited island. My companions were gone, and I had no provisions, tools, or means to survive. Thus began my life as a castaway. After being cast ashore, I lay for a while entirely overwhelmed by my condition. When I finally rose, I looked around me to understand where I was and to see if any of my companions had survived. I called out loudly, but there was no answer. None had made it to shore. The first thing I thought of was to search for food and shelter. I walked up and down the coastline, trying to find anything that had washed ashore from the shipwreck. To my relief, I spotted some parts of the ship lodged on a reef not far from the coast. Using some floating timber, I managed to make my way to the wreck. There, I found provisions, tools, and other items that could be useful for survival. I made several trips between the wreck and the shore, salvaging what I could: bread, rice, dried meat, tools, weapons, ammunition, and clothing. With these supplies, I began to plan for my survival. When I had brought all that I could get to shore, I found I had enough to supply me, even if I lived here for many years. But my next concern was to secure myself and my goods from any sudden attacks, whether from wild beasts or savages, if any should inhabit the place. I had noticed a small hill not far from the shore with a hollow space under a rock, which seemed a good spot to set up my dwelling. Using the tools I had salvaged, I began to clear and fortify this area, bringing my provisions there. I created a sort of barricade using pieces of wood and other debris from the ship. This became my first home on the island. While securing my provisions, I often reflected on my miserable condition. Alone on a desolate island, without hope of rescue, I felt utterly forsaken. Yet, amidst my despair, I began to think about my survival and what I could do to make my life tolerable. I decided to explore the island further. Venturing inland, I discovered it was much larger than I had initially thought, with abundant trees and various fruits, though I could not identify them all. I found a stream of fresh water, which was a great comfort. Returning to my makeshift home, I decided to organize my supplies more effectively. Among the items I had salvaged were several tools, including saws, hatchets, and hammers, as well as nails and other materials for construction. I also had a good supply of gunpowder and shot, which I knew would be crucial for hunting and defense. As I settled into my new life on the island, I began to realize how much I had taken for granted in the past. I had the skills to build, hunt, and gather, but I had never had to rely on them entirely. Now, every task I undertook was a challenge, but necessity is a powerful teacher. The first thing I needed was a more secure shelter, so I used the materials I had salvaged to build a small cabin of sorts, though it was rudimentary. I reinforced it with logs, and it provided me with some protection from the elements. For food, I began hunting and fishing. I found that the island was rich in animals, including goats and wild fowl, which I could catch with the weapons I had recovered. I also planted seeds I had found in the ship's provisions. These, too, began to take root and grow. I soon realized the importance of being organized. I kept my supplies in order, dividing them into categories: food, tools, clothing, and materials for building. The more methodical I became, the more I was able to manage my survival. I made a calendar, noting the days that passed since the shipwreck, as I had no way of knowing when or if I would be rescued. My next challenge was to tame the animals for their milk and wool. After some trials and patience, I succeeded in capturing a few goats, which became a reliable source of milk and meat. I even constructed a small pen to keep them secure, though at first they were difficult to manage. As the days turned into weeks and then months, I became more comfortable with the island. I learned to use my tools efficiently and began crafting simple furniture and clothing. I even made pots and containers for cooking, which improved the quality of my meals. I had become a true self-sustainer, but at times the loneliness was unbearable. I often reflected on my past life and wondered if I would ever see another human being again. One day, I was out hunting when I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought I might be imagining things, but as I approached, I realized it was no illusion. It was a footprint, clearly not my own. Someone had been on the island, and I could only wonder who they were. I saw the footprint. I felt a great sense of alarm. My first thought was that the island might be inhabited by savages, and I was filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. I had been on the island alone for so long that the thought of encountering another human being, whether friend or foe, was both thrilling and terrifying. I carefully followed the trail, staying hidden as best I could and hoping to avoid any danger. The footprint seemed to lead towards the other side of the island, and I cautiously made my way in that direction. For a long time, I saw no sign of anyone, but I kept my eyes open and my senses sharp. I had no weapons with me at the time, so I had to be cautious and strategic. As I moved further inland, the footprint grew fainter, and I wondered if it was just a figment of my imagination. But just as I was about to give up the search, I spotted something that made my heart race. In a small clearing, there was a campfire, smoldering but still fresh. It was evidence that someone had been there recently. My mind raced. Who could it be? A group of hostile natives? A shipwrecked sailor, like myself? The thought of being discovered by someone else, for better or worse, left me feeling uneasy and unprepared. I had been so used to living alone on the island that the idea of confronting another person was daunting. I quickly retreated to my shelter, deciding to remain hidden and observe from a distance. I spent the next few days cautiously watching the area where I had found the fire, but no one appeared. The days turned into weeks, and the mystery remained unsolved. I could only wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Certainly. Continuing from where we left off. After several weeks of watching and waiting, the mystery of the footprint continued to trouble me. I tried not to think about it too much, focusing instead on my daily survival. However, the uncertainty gnawed at me. I was constantly on edge, never sure if the person I had seen was an illusion or if someone was truly on the island with me. One day, as I was gathering firewood, I heard a sound in the distance. It was faint at first, but as I listened carefully, it grew louder. It sounded like a drumbeat, slow and rhythmic, but not too far off. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The thought of savages returned to my mind. I had no idea what to do. I rushed back to my shelter, keeping low and silent, and watched from behind a rock. I could see movement in the distance, figures walking along the shore. I couldn't make out their features clearly, but I could tell there were several of them. Fear gripped me, and I knew I had to stay hidden. The figures came closer, and I saw they were not alone. One of them seemed to be carrying something, a bundle of sticks perhaps, but it was difficult to make out. I watched in silence, my heart beating fast in my chest. They did not seem to notice me. The group passed by my shelter without stopping, continuing their journey down the coast. Once they had passed, I breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed they weren't hostile, but I could not be sure. Still, I knew I had to be cautious. For the next several days, I stayed hidden, watching them from a distance. I kept my movements as quiet as possible, making sure not to be spotted. The figures seemed to visit the shore occasionally, always in the same small group. Finally, one day, after a few weeks of watching them, I decided to approach them, carefully, quietly. I moved towards them while they were gathering wood, and as I drew nearer, I began to feel a sense of dread. What if they were savages? What if they had bad intentions? Just as I was about to make my move, one of them turned around suddenly and saw me. I froze. There was no way to retreat now. The figure stood still for a moment and then began to shout something in a language I couldn't understand. The other figures turned and saw me too. I felt a surge of fear and uncertainty, unsure of what would happen next. This moment is a critical turning point for Crusoe as he comes face to face with potential danger after being isolated. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The man who had first seen me shouted again, but I could not make out the words. The others now turned and stared at me, and I could see their faces more clearly. They were not the savage warriors I had feared, but instead looked like men who had been living a difficult life, possibly shipwrecked or stranded like me. I took a deep breath, hoping that I could communicate with them. I had no idea what language they spoke, but I knew I had to try to make peace. I waved my arms in the air to signal that I meant no harm, hoping that they would understand my peaceful intentions. One of the men, who appeared to be the leader, approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his side. He looked at me with suspicion, but seemed less aggressive than I had feared. I took another step forward, trying to show that I was unarmed and meant no danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the leader spoke. To my surprise, he spoke in broken English, though it was clear he was not a native speaker. "Who you? What you do here?" he asked, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "I am Robinson Crusoe," I said, trying to calm my nerves. "I was shipwrecked. I've been here alone for many years. I mean no harm." The leader nodded slowly, as if understanding my situation. He pointed at his companions and said, "We not from here. We lost. Been here long time? You help?" I felt a sense of relief wash over me. These men were not enemies, but fellow castaways like me. They had been stranded on the island for a long time, and now they were in need of help. I had no idea how they had come to the island, but I knew I could offer them some assistance in exchange for their companionship. "Of course, I will help," I said, eager to end my isolation. "Come with me. I have food and shelter." I led them back to my shelter, and they followed closely behind. As we walked, I learned that the men were from a ship that had been wrecked on the island some months earlier. They had been struggling to survive, and they were just as desperate for food and water as I had been when I first arrived. Over the next few days, I helped them rebuild their camp and shared my supplies with them. We hunted together and gathered food, and soon we were able to set up a more permanent settlement. Though they were grateful for my help, I still felt a lingering sense of unease. I had spent so many years alone on this island that it was difficult to trust anyone, even fellow castaways. The days passed, and I began to get used to the presence of the other men. There were 5 of them in total, and as we worked together, I began to learn more about their situation. Their ship had been struck by a violent storm, much like mine, and they had been cast ashore on the opposite side of the island. Unlike me, they had not been as fortunate in finding supplies, and they had been struggling to survive with little food or shelter. We worked together, building a larger shelter and securing a more sustainable food source. I showed them how to use the tools I had salvaged from the shipwreck, and we made improvements to our camp. For the first time since my arrival on the island, I felt a sense of camaraderie and relief. The isolation I had experienced for so long began to fade, and I found comfort in knowing that I was no longer alone. Despite this newfound company, there was still a sense of unease. The leader of the group, whose name I learned was Friday, was a quiet man, though friendly. He was the one who spoke the most English, and he translated for the others. Over time, I began to form a bond with him, teaching him English and sharing stories of my life before the island. In return, he taught me a little of his native language and helped me understand the customs of his people. One day, as I was walking along the beach, I noticed a strange sight. A group of men, dressed in native clothing, was approaching from the other side of the island. My heart raced in my chest as I realized they were not the same men I had been living with. These were likely the savages I had feared. I quickly ran back to our camp to warn the others. Friday and the rest of the group were alarmed when I told them about the approaching natives. They immediately began preparing for defense, gathering weapons and fortifying the shelter. I had no idea how many of them were out there or what their intentions were, but I knew we had to be ready for anything. The natives approached our camp, and I could see that they were armed with spears and bows. They stopped at a distance and began shouting. Friday, who seemed to understand their language, spoke to them in a calm voice, attempting to negotiate. The tension was unbearable as we waited for a response. After a long silence, the natives lowered their weapons, and Friday motioned for them to come closer. To my surprise, the natives did not attack. Instead, they seemed curious, though cautious. They spoke in their own language, and Friday acted as a mediator between us. Slowly, the men relaxed, and the atmosphere shifted from one of hostility to one of mutual curiosity. Over time, I came to understand that these were not enemies, but members of a different tribe who had been living on the island. We forged a fragile peace, and Friday acted as a translator, helping us communicate with the natives. After the initial encounter with the native group, we were cautiously optimistic. The natives, though initially wary, seemed more curious than hostile, and with Friday's help as a translator, we began to establish a basic understanding between us. While they didn't speak much English, they seemed willing to communicate with us, and we reciprocated in kind. For several days, we exchanged small gifts, tools, food, and even some of the clothing we had fashioned from the ship's materials. In return, the natives gave us items we had never seen before, such as fruits and herbs that grew only on their side of the island. Slowly, the mistrust between us began to dissolve. Friday and I took the lead in these exchanges, as he had a better grasp of their language than I did. The others in the group watched cautiously, but they, too, were relieved to see that we were not being attacked. Over time, we developed a sort of alliance, though it was fragile, based on mutual benefit and survival. The next major event that shook the peace was when a smaller party of natives arrived, seemingly from another tribe. They were more aggressive in nature, and immediately began to display hostility. They were armed and shouted at us in their native tongue, which sounded much more aggressive than the language of the first group. The situation quickly escalated as they began to approach our camp with hostile intent. At this point, I knew we had to take action to protect ourselves. I gathered the men, and we readied our weapons, swords, guns, and any other tools that could serve as a weapon. We had no idea what the intentions of these new natives were, but we had learned to trust our instincts in situations like this. Friday, seeing the rising tension, stepped forward and spoke to the new group in their language, trying to calm the situation. He gestured to us, trying to convey that we meant no harm and had already established a peaceful understanding with the first tribe. The response, however, was not as favorable as we had hoped. The new group seemed more determined to confront us. In a desperate attempt to avoid violence, I stepped forward, making myself visible to them. I raised my hands to show I was unarmed, trying to signal that we were not hostile. To my surprise, the aggressive natives paused and seemed to reconsider. Friday continued speaking to them in their language, and after what felt like an eternity, the mood shifted. It took time, but after several tense moments of negotiation, the aggressive group slowly began to lower their weapons. They weren't entirely convinced, but they agreed to stay away from our camp and gave us a wary truce. We knew we couldn't let our guard down entirely, but for the moment, we had avoided bloodshed. The encounter with the second group of natives left us all shaken. It made me realize that, although the island had seemed peaceful at first, there were still dangers lurking in the unknown parts of the land. Our fragile peace with the first group, led by Friday, was still intact, but I knew we needed to remain vigilant. In the days that followed, we reinforced our defenses. We built stronger barricades around our camp and set watch during the night. The presence of the second group had shaken our sense of security, and we knew that the island, once a quiet sanctuary, had become a place fraught with challenges we had to face together. In the aftermath of the tense encounter with the second group of natives, life on the island became more cautious. We continued to interact with the first group, led by Friday, but now with a heightened sense of alertness. The experience had taught us that things could change quickly, and we had to be prepared for anything. As we strengthened our defenses, I began to focus on improving our relationship with the first group. Friday, and I continued to communicate with them, learning more about their culture and customs. I was still wary, but over time, I began to see them not as enemies, but as people who had, like us, been stranded on the island and were just trying to survive. The first group, in return, began to trust us more. We exchanged more goods and shared resources, building a bond that seemed to benefit both sides. Friday, who had become my close companion and translator, was invaluable in these interactions, and his knowledge of the natives' ways proved crucial. But despite our growing alliance with the first group, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still danger on the island. The presence of the second group of natives had made me more aware of the delicate balance we were living in. I knew that if we were to survive and truly make the island a home, we would have to take further steps to secure our safety. One day, while we were out gathering food, Friday and I encountered a shipwrecked crew, another group of men who had been cast ashore. This time, there was no ambiguity about their intentions. They were sailors, much like us, and had come to the island in search of food and shelter after their own ship had been destroyed in a storm. They had been stranded on the opposite side of the island and were looking for help. We welcomed them into our camp, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was surrounded by people who spoke my language and shared similar experiences. They were grateful for the food and shelter we provided, and we shared stories of our lives before the island. The arrival of the new men brought a renewed sense of hope to our camp. We had gone from being a small, isolated group of castaways to a growing community, and the island that had once felt like a prison began to feel like a place where we could thrive. With the new group, we strengthened our defenses, built better structures, and began to form a more permanent settlement. However, even as we started to settle into a more comfortable routine, I knew that the island was not entirely safe. The natives still posed a threat, and there were always the risks of disease and famine. But now, with a larger group and more resources, we had a better chance of surviving, and perhaps even one day escaping the island. Here's the continuation of Robinson Crusoe. With the arrival of the new group of sailors, our community on the island grew, and we began to organize ourselves more effectively. The new men, grateful for our hospitality, quickly adapted to the ways of survival we had developed over the years. Together, we built a more substantial settlement, one that felt safer and more like a home than the temporary shelters we had once used. As our camp expanded, we focused on creating a more permanent food supply. We planted crops and made use of the land around us to ensure that we would have enough resources to support everyone. The island, which had once seemed desolate and barren, now felt like a place that could sustain us if we worked together. Despite these improvements, there was always a lingering awareness of the dangers around us. The threat of the second group of natives still loomed large, and we kept our guard up, even as we formed more peaceful relations with the first group. Friday and I continued to act as mediators, trying to keep the peace and avoid further conflict. But it was clear that the island was not a place where we could let our guard down completely. One day, as I was working near the beach, I noticed a strange sight on the horizon. A ship. It was a sight I hadn't seen in years. My heart leapt with excitement and disbelief. Could this be the rescue I had longed for? I ran back to the settlement, shouting to the others, and within moments, we had gathered at the shore, watching the ship as it sailed closer. The ship was a European vessel, and it appeared to be a merchant ship, not a military one. I had no idea who might be aboard or whether they would be able to help us. I had waited so long for this moment that I could hardly believe it was real. We signaled the ship, hoping they would see us. It took a long while for them to approach, but eventually, the ship anchored off the coast. A small boat was lowered, and a crew of sailors came ashore. The leader of the crew, a man named Captain Thomas, greeted us with a mix of surprise and relief. When I explained my story to him, he listened intently, astonished at the years I had spent on the island. He offered to take me back to England, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of overwhelming gratitude and hope. However, there was a dilemma. I had grown accustomed to the island and the men who had become my companions. Many of them, including Friday, wanted to stay. They had found a new life here and had become part of the community we had built. Although I was eager to return to civilization, I couldn't help but feel torn. The island had been my home for so long, and the idea of leaving it behind was difficult. Captain Thomas gave me time to think, understanding the emotional conflict I was facing. After much contemplation, I made the difficult decision to leave the island. I could not ignore the opportunity to return to society, to reunite with the world I had once known. But I also knew that I was leaving behind a life that had been a part of me for many years. As I prepared to leave, I made arrangements for the others who wanted to stay. I gave them the tools and knowledge they would need to continue living on the island, and I promised to return one day to check on them. When the time came to board the ship, I felt a sense of bittersweet farewell. I was leaving a place that had shaped me in ways I could never fully describe, but I was also embracing the possibility of returning to civilization. As the day of departure drew closer, I spent my remaining time on the island reflecting on all that had happened. I walked through the settlement one last time, visiting the places that had become so familiar to me, the shelter, the fields we had cultivated, and the places where I had faced hardship and triumph. It felt surreal, as if I were leaving a dream behind. The island had been both a prison and a refuge, and now I was preparing to leave it for good. Friday, the companion who had become like a brother to me, was particularly affected by my decision. He had grown to love the island and the life we had built together. He had learned English, adopted some of our ways, and had found his place in the community. When I told him of my plans to leave, he was filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He understood the necessity of my decision, but didn't want me to go. "Master," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "will you leave me here alone?" I reassured him that I wasn't leaving him forever. I promised that if it were possible, I would return to visit, and I offered to take him with me if he wanted to join me in England. The thought of bringing him to civilization was a tempting one, but I wasn't sure how he would adapt to such a different life. After much deliberation, Friday chose to remain on the island. He had a sense of belonging there now, and though he would miss me, he knew that he was better suited to the life we had carved out together. His decision brought a sense of peace to me. I knew that he would be able to survive on the island without me, and I trusted that he would continue to build the life we had started. On the morning of my departure, I said my final goodbyes to the men who had become my companions. They expressed their gratitude, and we parted ways on good terms. It was a poignant moment, filled with a sense of loss, but also of hope for the future. As I boarded the ship, I looked back at the island one last time. It stood in the distance, an unchanging monument to the years I had spent there. The ship's sails filled with wind, and I turned my gaze forward toward the world I had once known and was about to return to. The journey back to England was long, but it was also a time of healing. I had been away from civilization for so many years that the sights and sounds of the world I once knew felt strange and unfamiliar. Yet, as the ship neared England's shores, I felt a sense of anticipation building inside me. I was returning to a world of society, of culture, of family and friends. It was a world that had moved on without me, but I was ready to rejoin it. When the ship finally docked, I stepped onto solid ground for the first time in years. The feeling was overwhelming. I had returned to the bustling streets of London, a city filled with people and noise, a far cry from the solitude of the island. Everything was new again, but I was determined to reintegrate into society and make up for lost time.